Hello, everyone. I am very pleased and honored to welcome another guest of the AIOCS Conversations, Dr. Luke Barnes. Hello, Luke.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to talk to me and the viewers. I must confess that this is one of those days when talking about more pleasant things looks like a good way of forgetting, at least for a moment, about the unfolding tragedy in our world. Perhaps the viewers already got scared seeing my Romanian national attire. I put it on, something like a sign of solidarity, but also of grief. This is more of a funeral colors, isn't it? Black and white for what actually unfolds in Ukraine. So much grief there, and so much suffering, and so much death. But let's return to brighter things. Although we could go for quite a while only talking about politics, science, and Orthodox faith in the Ukrainian conflict, we won't do that, isn't it? We will be focusing on something that has a wider range, getting to a phenomenon that is perhaps intrinsic to our culture, a culture of dichotomies, a culture of dualities, of binaries. It's either or in so many respects, in so many regards. You know, even this, how could two nations coexist? It's either or. Two nations can't coexist. The binary that we are thinking of today has to do with faith and science. As we know, there's a stereotype out there ravaging many corners of the community in the so-called first world. People that believe, are convinced that there's no way of bridging faith and science. Well, today we have a reason to question, if not counteract that narrative, in that the man that sits in front of me, Dr. Luke Barnes, embodies both worlds. He's a believer and a scientist. But before I give Luke the opportunity to speak about himself and then to roll the ball with the conversation, as my custom goes, and I hope you won't mind my custom, Luke, just a few things about you. I'm certain that the viewers will be able to retrieve much more information. This is Dr. Barnes's official page at the University of Sydney. It's a bit of a
Western Sydney.
Sorry.
I have to be specific about that.
What did I say?
You said University of Sydney.
Oh,
this is, yeah, Western Sydney University.
Western Sydney. My apologies. It's one of those days.
That's all right.
The University of Western Sydney, as everyone can see there. These are just a few details, but there's also contact. And I know Luke is very active answering all those interesting queries from people. What was that thing in your book in Cosmic Revolutionaries Handbook? People who try to demolish the Big Bang by publishing their articles or essays in some journal of basket weaving, stuff like that. Well, he loves all these this kind of message coming to his inbox, I know. But anyway, you have a broader list of his publications, although I'm certain the university could add more there.
Yeah, I just
As
got a reminder today. I need to go and add, update that. Yeah.
All our official pages are so out of date that it seems that we are already retired. There's no activity to mention in the last 10 years or so. And teaching. Then something that is quite exciting, but perhaps some of you have already seen Luke talking for the famous podcast Closer to Truth. There's a page there with his profile, and I'm certain you'll be able to trace the right video. I've seen one. I don't know if you've been more than once.
It was one long one cut up into a bunch of segments.
Okay, so that's it. Yeah. And of course, the very exciting undertaking, Luke, having this very fine activity with Geraint Lewis on YouTube. And I understand now you are present on a very important European channel, isn't it? With your Alas, Lewis and Barnes, isn't it?
Well, it's funny you put it out there, and it keeps turning up in all sorts of places. So yeah.
Okay. So I know BriefBox or something has you. And of course, two works that Luke has published together with Geraint, A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos, and the book I have just mentioned, which is a fun thing to read, The Cosmic Revolutionary's Handbook, How to Beat the Big Bang. Well, these are just a few highlights. And on this note, I turn to Luke, asking him to share with us something about his journey. How come a scientist, an astrophysicist, a cosmologist, and a believer? Is this an easy life? Or have you encountered, do you still encounter issues? Do you have difficulties with being a believer, a Christian believer, and a scientist?
Well, on the day-to-day work as a scientist, my fellow scientists, we just sort of want to get on with studying the universe. And so actually on a day-to-day level, there's not much of a problem there. As long as you're committed to taking a scientific approach to studying scientific matters, if you want to work out the way the universe works, then no one much cares what other beliefs you may or may not have. It occasionally will come up in discussions, after work down at the at the pub or wherever. But in the sort of day-to-day world of the work as a scientist, not particularly. I should say I was a believer before I was a scientist. I grew up in a Christian household, and part of becoming a scientist and a believer was hearing so many voices saying that these two things were just impossible, and continuing to try and read as much as I could from all sorts of sides on all of this. And at the end of the day, both perspectives, met in harmony. I found the arguments that they were necessarily in conflict to be quite weak in the end.
That's great, and it's important to mention the fact that apart from the daily work of Luke as a scientist, he's also involved in an organization like AIOCS. Actually, we are both colleagues there, from a distance. Not only, well, geographic, not so far, because we both live in Sydney, but perhaps career-wise or ideological. I'm a theologian. And he's a fellow of AIOCS, and he's involved with the activities of this organization, which is largely an organization set up by scientists and technologists but which also welcomes other professionals, from philosophers to educators to theologians and so on and so forth. So he's also active. What I mean, Luke is active on that front of broadening the conversation between various walks of life and approaches and fields of study. Look, thank you for sharing this insight into your life and formation. And I'd like to take it from where you left it and see if we can discuss a bit the problems that people might face when they think of faith and science. Because for many people, some of them even educated, we know there are famous cases, and we shouldn't mention here new atheism and all that, but people with some degrees, and careers in academia and so on and so forth, still believe that faith and science are irreconcilable. I'm not talking here about agnostics or atheists that simply have a certain choice in life. That was their choice, and respect the choices of others. I'm talking about the militant ones who declare total war against the idea of bridging the gap between the world of science and technology on the one hand and the world of faith. Have you had any thought? Have you given any thought to the causes that might keep people apart, or what would determine people within our culture, especially in the so-called first world countries, to believe that science and faith cannot be reconciled?
So I think there's a few things going on here. One of them is that there are people who think that sacred texts such as the Bible make specific scientific claims, which then can be tested. And so I grew up in a background that was young Earth creationist. I published a sort of brief history of my journey out of young Earth creationism recently. You can find that at Premier Magazine. Basically, as I looked deeper and deeper into both the theological and the scientific arguments that the sort of people who say that Genesis teaches that the world is roughly 6,000 years old, I was increasingly not impressed by either of them. And in particular, becoming an astrophysicist, I had the ability to look at their scientific arguments for myself, not taking their word for it or someone else's word for it, but actually being able to appraise the evidence myself. And time and again, they just didn't stand up as far as I could see. But if you have that view that the Bible teaches specific scientific facts, then there is at least a conversation on that level. There could be perceived differences there. The worry I have about that approach is that the Bible was written to people who were supposed to understand it at the time. And so it's speaking to people not about scientific things. And if it mentions anything about the world around it, it's really to illustrate, almost always to illustrate some theological point that's being made. So there's a passage in Ecclesiastes, which I should really memorize this more exactly, but it says something like, all the rivers run to the sea, and yet the sea is not full. From the place the waters come, there they return. And I mean, it's talking broadly about the water cycle, but it's not trying to teach about the water cycle. It's just making some sort of point. It's making a point about things in nature seeming to go around. All of life seems to be sort of circular in a sense, and you can get sort of cast down by this and think that everything just goes in circles. So if it's just trying to reach people where they are, then you wouldn't expect there to be sort of modern scientific facts. But beyond that sort of, you might call it a literal reading of the Bible, there's a deeper argument that you get from the new atheists and from other atheists as well, from perhaps more philosophically sophisticated atheists, that there's a difference in science. There's a clash between the sort of the way they try to understand the world. that it's not just specific facts, but it's a way of understanding the world, a way of approaching things, a way of reasoning. So if you're a scientist, supposedly you only believe things you have good evidence for, and that has to be based on the only source of information that we've found to be reliable, which is our senses, and then scientific reasoning from our senses. And those are the only sorts of views that are reasonable to hold, versus supposedly the worldview of faith, which is just you accept things for whatever reason because you find comforting. There's all sorts of stories that are told about faith. So supposedly the scientific brain and the faith brain are wired completely differently about what they do with evidence. So they can't exist in one head without there being some sort of, split down the middle where, most of the days of the week I actually care about evidence and truth. And then on Sundays, I just believe whatever I like. And then
Legal and
we go.
Golem.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good analogy, actually. Yeah. Yeah. So if science and faith are in fact two competing ways of understanding truth, trying to get to the truth, then you've got a problem there. Well, a potential problem at least. Maybe they'll agree on everything. But I think if you look at faith, especially that word in the New Testament, it's not a way of knowing. It's a question of what you do with the things that you know. Is the way that I would try and understand that. Not being a theologian myself, of course, but
You do quite well.
that's the approach that I see. And so there's not different standards of evidence or different ways that you approach evidence or even different questions that there are different questions, of course. There's not a sort of difference in rationality between the way I approach Christianity and the way I approach science. They deal with different topics, of course, but I don't see myself as being split down the middle as to how I handle evidence in the search for truth.
That's great. And as a matter of fact, it's quite interesting you put it that way. And I repeat for the viewers, you are the embodiment, and others, of course, but I'm talking to you, and you are the embodiment of the fact that the myth should be busted, that it's not impossible to walk on both whatever sides of the divide or the river, whatever we have to call it. And you made a very interesting point that faith isn't just a matter of passively agreeing to something or accepting something. As a theologically trained person, I have been always interested in this topic of faith and reason. Given my academic interest in early Christianity, what I can share, if you would indulge me, is the fact that the great theologians of the past, of the so-called golden era of Christianity and so on and so forth, I don't know why it's called that way, but it doesn't matter. So yeah, the early centuries, perhaps because they were historically closer to Jesus and his apostles, theologians were actually very committed thinkers. There was no way of addressing faith in terms of believe and search not. Yeah. Famous adage, supposedly characterizing people of faith. It's not that, and what I have learned from my study of early Christianity is that those people were profoundly interested in making sense of things. Only the difference between their non-Christian colleagues in philosophy, natural philosophy, and so on and so forth, is that for these people, the act of knowing was somehow richer. And I believe that this is an opportunity for us to discuss, if you would like to do so. What does faith bring to you as a scientist? Is it a different insight into the mysteries of reality, or mystery of the universe? does your faith enrich your view of things, your perception of reality, or it's simply something that, as you said at some point, it's my Sunday form, or my Sunday approach to life and stuff like that.
So I think faith there is being used in a very broad sense of sort of the totality of what I believe. In you might say worldview, although that term gets used an awful lot. In terms of what do I think the fundamental structure of reality is, and all those sorts of things, not just on a scientific level, but even more broadly. So what that brings to the science is, first of all, an underlying conviction that the most fundamental sort of thing is more like a mind than like matter. So that I mean, God is the ultimate reality, and if that's true, then ultimate reality is more like a mind than just sort of a mechanical machine, right? So rationality, then, I mean, we speak of rationality being scientific, but there's a sort of sense in which it's not material. So it's not it's thinking, it's thought, it's mentality, it's a mind-like kind of thing. So if we want to say we're going to take that approach to the world as scientifically, I mean, the question then, if you're say a naturalist, if you think the world is all there is why would we expect that to work? I mean, I can try and be rational, but why expect what's out there to sort of respond to a rational inquiry? So if you think of an old school TV with that just has is in between the channels, and it just has snow, just static on the screen, black and white randomly, you can approach that pattern logically and reasonably, and you can develop, you could develop all sorts of ways of analyzing that pattern and looking for patterns and recognizing shapes if they're there, and you can do all that, and it's great. But if you pointed at the randomness of that TV, you're not going to see anything. It's just you came rationally, but there was no rationality on the other side, as opposed to if you looked out the window and you recognized a tree or something. So we bring a rational approach to nature, but we find a rationality there waiting for us. It's a bit like coming to a crossword puzzle. I bring my my skills and my knowledge of vocabulary and that to the puzzle, but there's got to be an answer behind the puzzle before if I'm actually going to solve this thing. So time and again, what we see in nature is sort of we see these laws underneath the universe which suggest a rationality at the deepest level, not just a sort of beauty in what we see and the amazingness of the physical world, especially the natural world, sort of biological world, but the rationality I bring to my study is met by a rationality that's already there waiting to be discovered. And as a theist, as a believer, as someone with faith in the broad sense of that sort of worldview, that all fits together. There is a rationality there waiting to be discovered. It's not just going to lay itself out for us like a completed crossword that we can just read off. We've got to do our job of trying to understand it, as rationally as we can. But there is a pattern there. There are laws to be discovered. There is a way that nature works. There is a beauty and an elegance behind it. And so that's one of the things I bring. The reason I think the scientific method will continue to work is because there is already a rationality in nature, and if we work hard enough, we can see bits and pieces of that. There's a quote which is either by Kepler or it's attributed to Kepler, and it's sort of a paraphrase of his, but he expressed the idea of wanting to think God's thoughts after him. So that there is already a rationality there, and if we get to sort of peek behind the scenes a bit, we'll get to see some of that inner workings. So I think that's what it brings. So I believe nature is well put together and worthy of scientific insight and discovery and investigation, because there is already a mind behind it who has ordered it in a way that we can understand if we're smart enough and we work hard enough.
So in a way, it's as though you'd say it's not just faith that somehow enriches or perhaps guides your worldview, as I put it earlier, it's more of a reciprocity. Somehow, the science that you do and your colleagues help you and all of us realize that some of the statements of our faith can be actually verified. Like, for instance, the gospel that is dearest to me is that of John, and it begins with the famous line that in the beginning was the Logos. I know in many modern translations the word is rendered as word. That's not what the original Greek word means, you know, as you know very well. It means a lot of things, actually. Word is the expression of a thought, but it's also the thought. Logos is also reason. Logos is also a principle or a measure of things. And perhaps there are some elements of our faith, at least in relation to making sense of the cosmos, that should be put forward more, I think, prominently, rather than the usual conversation about God did this and all of a sudden the universe popped up into being out of nothing, equipped with all the signs of a history of billions of years, when in reality it's just yesterday. So rather than going with that kind of narrative, which actually challenges science and does so lamely and blindly, ignorantly, we could bring forth subtler elements of the Christian tradition, like the theory of the Logos and our faith, you know, our conviction that there's a Logos behind all things, and then this would constitute for us believers, but also scientists like you, a way ahead, you know, somehow towards acquiring a better, more comprehensive understanding of things.
Yeah, one of the things that's been impressed on me just more recently, especially as I've read more sophisticated sort of atheists thinking about science, is that the difference, it's not really a competition, atheism, Christianity, of two different explanations of the world. When you actually understand what's going on here, for a question as deep as why is there order in the world at all, or why is there a world at all, why does anything at all exist, it's the competition between the theist, which says there is a deeper explanation, versus the honest and I think, you know, more sophisticated atheist, naturalist, who says there is no explanation for the existence of the world, why there is order at all in the natural world around us. And so what the naturalist who's trying to convince you that there's nothing except the world has to try to convince you that those leftover questions that you had, like why is there a world at all and why is it ordered and all that sort of stuff, that actually it's not just that they have a better answer, it's that you didn't really want an answer. It's better to say there is no answer. And that's the two things we're trying to weigh up here. And if you try and say, you know, it's explanation in terms of God versus explanation in terms of science, then all the successes of science seem to work against God. And so it seems like the balance tips away from God. But if you actually understand on that deeper level, no, it's between having an explanation and not having an explanation. Suddenly there's no obvious rational, you know, way to go there. And if anything, you tip towards, well, shouldn't things have an explanation rather than just leaving them hanging, dangling in midair? And especially in terms of, I think one of the major sort of points where this rips open, and it's an amazingly simple question, but just what is a law of nature? It's it's one of those sort of subtle, it's like asking what is time. You know, you can ask it so simply, but then you're just lost very quickly into very deep water. But what is a law of nature? What is it actually that we're doing in a physics textbook, you know, like I have behind me and around me? What are these things? And one of the answers today, so there's various schools of thought on this. One of them that's reasonably popular today, which follows from the tradition of David Hume, is to simply say there is just the set of natural events out there. They just are what they are. And as we observe them, we try to organize them into a system which best summarizes the events that we see out there in nature. So we're just presented with a way that the world is, and then what the laws of nature are, and all there is to be a law of nature is that in some way it summarizes what's going on out there. So the law of gravity, for Newton, for example, is just not saying anything about way things pull on anything else. All it really is there's the way that the solar system is over time. There's a planet there, and tomorrow it'll be over there, and that one will be over there. The best way we summarize that is just that equation that Newton presented, or if Einstein presented, whichever equation you want to go with. If that's your view of what a law is, it leaves completely unanswered the question of why can we make these sorts of summaries at all? Again, if I present you with that as sort of a random picture of dots of black and white, snow on an old TV screen, and I say, summarize what's going on there, there's not much you can do other than saying it looks completely random. If you wanted to completely specify what's going on, you'd have to say, okay, there's a white dot and then a black dot and then two white dots and all the way through the screen. Whereas if you had a completely blue screen, you could just say the whole screen is blue. Or if you had a picture of an apple, you could say you have a picture of a green apple or whatever. There's no way to summarize that. So in that view, and that's not the only view of the laws of nature, but you just see how actually when you understand that, there's this massive question left over. Why does science work at all? Why is it that when I look at the universe, I can actually make these astoundingly great summaries of what's going on here, like seeing all the pieces of a puzzle and then having them all fit together into one coherent picture is left completely unanswered by that sort of approach. And so I think behind the scenes on these sorts of deeper issues, not the questions of, how do you believe this or how do you believe that, or whether this bit of the Bible contradicts with that bit of science or something, but actually at the deeper level of, okay, the view of the world that we have from science, what questions are left over and do we want answers to them? I think is really where the conversation between these two worldviews needs to be.
And so there's another school of thought that would allow for these questions to be asked, at least. The Hume kind of approach just describes the apple or the static on the TV screen without asking questions like, okay, so is there something behind that, or did anyone write those letters that we read? Or has anyone composed the music that we're listening to and stuff like that? Okay, so there's this other school of thought, to use your phrase, that would allow for these kind of questions that sort of get near to a kind of philosophical cast of mind, a metaphysical cast of mind. And are these other voices, is this other school of thought equally legitimate in the scientific community? This is something that actually interests me immensely, because like many non-scientists, I believe that science is indeed about facts. At least this is the narrative that we find in most places. It's about facts. Describe the apple. The apple is an apple. Stuff like that, Okay, but is it legitimate, or equally legitimate for the scientific community to have questions like, is there something else about those laws? Can we discern other reasons and so on?
Yeah, so I think it's actually it's a funny thing that the question, what is a scientific law, is a philosophical question. As a scientist, so when I see a law, I know what to do with it, right? I go and try and solve it and try to predict observations and then try and see whether observations actually match the prediction. And then I think the law has something to do with the way the world works. But so I know what to do with a law, but the question of what it is, what feature of the actual world is it picking out, is really metaphysics rather than physics. It's got to be. It's got to be. It's obviously got to be informed by the science, but it just won't be answered by the science. You can't answer it metaphysically just sitting in a cave doing, staring at the wall. You've got to actually go and do the science. But, very different views of what the laws are still lead to the same sorts of scientific approaches. And so I don't think, the scientific community, I think a lot of people would just have a very intuitive understanding of what a law of nature is that would just be very closely related to, what you do with it. And you might get some old school sort of what's called instrumentalism, that all we're doing is summarizing the readings that we get on our scientific instruments. We don't attempt to say anything about what's going on behind the scenes. But I think a lot of scientists would have some sort of realism in their mind. There's got to be some sort of physical picture about what laws are. They must be saying something about the real world. So I think if you ask the scientific community what their view of the laws of nature are, you're asking people who have a lot of the knowledge to answer that question, but actually it's a philosophical question, not a scientific one. So there's more required. So even if it's not okay, getting back to your question, even if it's the question of whether it's okay for a scientist to ask those questions, you could, in principle, say, well, no, because it's a metaphysical question. But as a scientist, the fact that a scientist is a person can ask that question. A scientist is well placed to understand what laws, what you do with a law and what they actually look like on paper and all those sorts of things. But you are actually asking a philosophical question there, a metaphysical question, a question about that's sort of bigger than just science itself, that you don't answer that question just by doing ordinary science of solving, as a physicist doing science, solving equations, doing observations, seeing if they match, rinse and repeat.
So in a way, let me be a bit reductionist and perhaps use the vocabulary that isn't yours. There's room within the scientific process for, let's call it, analysis and interpretation. So examination of facts, experiment and all that would be the analysis of the world, of reality, and interpretation, an area where you should, not only can, ask those questions as what's a natural law, what this all means, and so on and so forth. And if that's the case, if there's room for interpretation, and as persons, to put it, as persons, scientists have their own questions, then the scientific process isn't so objective as some voices might want to present it. It's not just hard data and equations and all that. There's always someone that reads the equations. There's always someone that reads the equations the way someone can read the equations, being better or worse equipped for doing so. And in so doing, there's a lot of interpretation that creeps into the process of scientific, I don't know how to call it, reflection. And if that's the case, then answers of the kind of, for instance, you give, well, my science doesn't deny God, just doesn't say anything significant in terms of God's nature. if I can divine a bit your answer. And there's people that say, well, this science actually tells them that there's no God, and if they walk on a pebbly beach and turn all the rocks from that beach, they won't find one that says God was here. So that's not actually science. That's more of a conviction, personal conviction. That's more of an interpretation. And if that's the case, and we have these personal interpretations of what science might signify, might mean, then there's room for various other interpretations of the same scientific data.
So there's two issues there. There's the issue of scientists doing science, and then there's the issue of scientists doing philosophy. So I think scientists doing science, the aim is always and will always be to be as objective as you possibly can be. But that's an ideal, of course. But that's what you're always aiming for. And there's a practical toolkit that you build up as a scientist to try to remove sources of bias and those sorts of things. So in terms of, if we weren't aimed at, being objective, the problem is we could just sort of make up whatever we wanted to about the world.
That's the toolkit for people like me to understand what you're talking about. Go for it.
Yeah, we do go into this. So this is, it's behind me as well. With Geraint. So yeah, we talk about that a bit in chapter 1, quite a bit actually. One of the reasons for that is, one of the reasons we wrote that book, The Cosmic Revolutionary's Handbook, was because we do get emails all the time just from people who are like, oh, here's my idea about how the universe works. Why aren't I famous yet? It's my interpretation of those emails. But we found that actually there's a whole bunch of very basic things that you want to have as a scientist, try to do as a scientist, which these were often sort of missing. So a very obvious one for a lot of them was just, if you're a scientist, the idea is to predict or explain, in whatever order they come about, observations of the world. Our observations of the world are very often measurements of the world in using some very precise, measuring tool. And so if you want to explain those or predict those, ideally, you're going to have to do some mathematics at some point because they're numbers. And so we very often get emails and there's a comment in there that says something like, oh, I know my idea's right, I just can't do the maths. Well, then you don't know if your idea's right, do you? Because you don't really have the tool that you need to predict data until you've got all of that there. So there is a standard toolkit putting it. So one of the great examples of that, which we discuss in the book, was the name Big Bang Theory comes from Fred Hoyle, a famous astrophysicist and actually atheist from the 20th century. There's some very important predictions from the Big Bang Theory, from the idea, from the theory, from the model itself, of what chemical elements would be left over from the first stages of the universe. Now, we don't need to go into the scientific details. The point is that Fred Hoyle made up the term Big Bang as a way of mocking the theory. He never accepted it. He thought it was totally wrong, but he could still make predictions from the theory, which are still used today. There's a famous paper which has his name on it where he makes these predictions. Some of those predictions turned out to be right. The point is that there's someone whose bias was against the theory but was still able to use it because it was mathematically formulated. So that's one example of the sort of, as a scientist, you try to build up the sort of toolkit that you have to be objective as possible, to the point where someone who has the opposite bias could still make the same predictions from your model. Mathematics obviously helps us out with that a lot. On the other hand, when a scientist then approaches a philosophical question, such as, is there anything more than the natural world, including does God exist, and all those sorts of questions, I wouldn't want to say it's a question of bias or subjectivity, as it is just the first and foremost for a lot of scientists, it's outside of our field of expertise. There is a lot that goes into a philosopher's training that we don't have. And I know this because I've tried to actually fill in some of those gaps. And there's an awful lot going on there, a lot of ideas that have been thought through very deeply by a lot of people over a lot of time, including such basic toolkit as logic, deductive logic, being able to really analyze, and inductive logic for that matter, being able to really analyze, arguments and argument forms and all those sorts of things, which you have to some extent intuitively as a scientist, but an awful lot of scientists don't have any formal training in that sort of thing, whereas a philosopher will. And so it's these other sort of deeper philosophical questions. I don't want to say it's just subjective, believe whatever you like. The fact that there's disagreement among scientists themselves, I think one of the causes of that I don't want to write it off entirely, but one of the causes of that is just we're outside of our field of expertise. Of course, there's a lot of disagreement amongst philosophers as well, but at least I find that those sorts of conversations and more philosophically inclined, trained, those who actually respect the discipline of philosophy amongst scientists, there's just a higher level of discussion there, which is actually getting into the issues rather than getting caught up with, logic traps and word traps and simple arguments that they've never actually thought through, that have, assumptions behind them they've never really analyzed, and it's just a lower level of conversation.
Yeah, well, but can be lower compared to the idea of or the ideals of making science per se. But the fact that this is even discussed, that there's room for questions and all that, I think gives us believers, gives us an opportunity to return to our original question and answer regarding the role of faith. Faith can have its own say. I mean, not as in dictates of I don't know what conclave or council or stuff like that. No, but it could have its own say in terms of bringing something, or at least giving what you would call providing a philosophical nuance to an ongoing conversation, at least as that conversation is conceived by scientists. If there's room for some kind of philosophical discussion, more or less educated around the processes of science, then there's also room for some kind of faith, but not that kind of lame, blind, intolerant faith, but one that actually seeks questions and answers, seeks to understand. And this is something that I have found consistently in the early Christian literature, where faith was never taken for granted, as in tick some boxes and full stop, and nothing else exists, and no other way of thinking exists. Faith was actually understood as a how should I put it, theologically conditioned or theologically framed way of thinking. But faith was understood, and I'm paraphrasing now one of my favorite Byzantine theologians, Maximus the Confessor. He would never consider faith inactive, passive. He would consider faith a state of the mind that addresses questions, seeks answers, but it does so while it is committed to the idea that there is something there, and that something has a certain profile, like the Logos, for instance. By the way, Maximus was very strong in the theory of the Logos, developing a genuine Byzantine cosmology, which I enjoy calling a theory of everything. Perhaps a narrative theory sounds too scientific, but actually he tried that and did that, at least in the framework of the available culture, 7th century. But if faith can be a way of thinking that takes in consideration reality as a whole, not just divine, angelic, spiritual beings, but also the natural world, and this is what Maximus and many others do when they think of faith, then faith can also be invited to be part of that conversation. If there's room for philosophers or poets or artists, there's also room for faith. And this is one of the things that actually interests me much, because I personally, I trust science. And I'm not talking only about the fact that I got my third shot, vaccine and stuff. I did that.
Yeah, Monday. I got mine on Monday.
Congratulations. I did that like a couple of weeks ago. So I trust science, because I believe it's part and parcel of the human adventure to have, well, perhaps a critical and attentive appreciation for what we create as beings able to think and consider things and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. I trust science, but I believe that there's room for all these other ways of looking at things, without these other ways of looking at things claiming to be scientific. And this again harkens back to what you said earlier, that there are people, believers, who say, the Bible gives us divinely certified or divinely authenticated science, and therefore we don't need science per se. But if we understand faith in this broader sense as a certain, well, let's call it theologically conditioned way of searching answers, then I assume if there's room for philosophy at your table, then there should be also room for faith. And that's what motivates me, for instance, to ask people like you, scientists, or other people, philosophers, theologians, and so on and so forth, about the possibility of this broader view of things.
Yeah. I think there is a slight worry there in the way we use words, that when you say something like there's room for faith in those conversations, I think there's a group of people who interpret that as meaning, we don't know everything, so I'm free to just stick whatever religious stuff I like into the gaps and just sort of, I'm allowed to feel, But that's not what I mean either. I think once you understand that, there are these sort of big questions left over. So one of the ways I like to, I've seen it phrased, which I particularly like, is there's what is the fundamental stuff of nature most like? And so if you're a materialist or a naturalist, it's more like matter. It's just sort of mindless things that move mechanically and all those sorts, it's that sort of stuff at the bottom. There is a school of thought, maybe going back to Plato, but I know some modern thinkers who think it this way as well, that actually mathematics is the most fundamental thing. Things are more like mathematics, where actually, to be mathematically consistent is the same as existing. There's actually a physicist called Max Tegmark who's put forward that sort of idea. And there being room for faith, I think, is us saying not, well, we don't know, so let's just believe whatever we like. But there's another option there. There's the sort of thing that a mind is. Let's bring that to the table, not in the sense of I can just believe this because I want to, but this is a live option. The sort of thing that a mind is. Maybe it doesn't just reduce down to matter or down to mathematics. Each of those schools of thought is trying to say that we're at the bottom and everything else just sort of reduces down to us. That's a school of thought which deserves its place at the table because it's a viable option for explaining the way the world is. And so I think that sort of approach, I would actually, the reason why, as a believer, we keep talking about faith is because there's the continual call in the New Testament, I think, that this is all of your, it matters to all of your life. This isn't some theoretical underpinning. The ultimate reality is God. God is goodness itself. So that very quickly turns into Jesus's, be good as your heavenly Father is good. And it matters to all of your life at every moment, which is why faith is such an all-encompassing thing. And so, that sort of perspective of faith, it's not that I'm just believing whatever I want. It's that I have an entire worldview here, which tries to put the whole thing together. I think the worry is that people, if you're a hardcore atheist, materialist, then I assume that something like morality, one of the things you could believe about morality, I don't want to make any sort of massive generalizations, is that it's just a way that we decide to behave in the world, and there's not really right and wrong, but there's whatever you want from life, there's smarter and less smart ways of doing that, so be smart about that, and eventually you'll end up with a moral code. basically saying in reality itself, there's no right and wrong. So you're free to just sort of live life however you want. I think what they worry about is what we're doing in faith is what they're doing with morality. We're doing that with truth. We don't know everything, so just believe whatever you like. As they're saying, look, there is no right and wrong, so just do whatever you like, but be smart about it. Don't just you'll mess up your life. And I think we want to keep bringing it back to truth and goodness and beauty, for that matter, all come together in this worldview. It's not a case of believing whatever I like. I have an approach to truth and evidence which values both of those. It's not just a matter of believing what I want. And so in that sense, room for faith, I think, would say room for the sorts of answers to these questions that are found in faith traditions, and that some, as you say, those early thinkers in the church and before and after and all of it, that sort of did some very deep thinking about.
Yeah, well, I assume, as you said already during this conversation, that we should draw some lines, and of course, it's not a matter of filling gaps in the scientific narrative by way of theological or philosophical statements. It's a matter of putting at the center, I think, the person of the scientist in your case, a person who is a scientist but also a believer or a philosopher or an artist, a poet or something, and my idea is of a complementarity of perspectives where scientific authority is never questioned, not by non-scientists. I understand very well the process, and for instance, my articles on high theology in the Balkans' Journal of Basket Weaving will never claim to challenge science, because that's not what I do and that's not what I believe. As I said, I trust science. But on the other hand, I'm a person, I'm a human being, and I have questions that scientific reductionism cannot answer. And you mentioned that, for instance, you mentioned something quite beautiful, that there's a mind out there, irreducible to measurements and stuff like that. I'm certain that that's not a widespread belief in the scientific community, although I know of at least the work of Henry Stapp and others, in that kind of school of thought that make of mind something that is more of a scientific principle. I'm certain that that's not what you mean. But what I think is that as persons, and we shouldn't forget that scientists or whatever we are still human beings and have broader questions than our immediate expertise. As persons, we need that kind of complementarity. That's my point. I'm not talking about piling up on top of science layers upon layers of philosophy, metaphysics, poetry, philosophy, and theology of all sorts. It's more a matter of bringing in the middle of all these the person of the scientist who might also have certain other convictions. And I believe that this is what you embody, actually. Being a scientist and a believer, you embody that very possibility, which is, I think, hope-giving, not for science, not for faith, but for humanity.
Yeah, for me, the main thing is a friend of mine invited me to speak to the youth group at his church a while ago, and he said about 70% of what you'll achieve by turning up is just them seeing someone who is a scientist and is a Christian. Like, I'm actually a real person. And that's about, that alone does most of the work. And then I'll talk about whatever I particularly want to talk about. I think I was talking about that book, The Fortunate Universe. But just to know that I actually exist. There are scientists who are Christian. There's loads of them. It's not just me, obviously. And that I'm not, it's not Smeagol and Gollum. I'm not talking to myself. I don't have wild mood swings or, massive, I just sort of shift one brain out and put the other brain in on Sundays. there is actually a sort of at least trying to be one coherent person here. That is, I think, an important thing.
Thank you very much, Luke. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you very much for your insights.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great stuff.